Right, so I'd like to welcome you to our very first screencast for Chapter 10. Chapter 10 is going to be broken down into two episodes, and this chapter is going to focus on classification, and it's going to focus on phylogeny of animals. All right, so looking at this first slide, you're going to notice we have a word at the very top of this slide, and this word is diversity. And to be diverse basically means to be different. Now, when it comes down to history, all cultures have classified or grouped animals based on the diversity that they've noticed. And what they would do is they would look for patterns of similarity between members of that group. Right? Now, when you talk about classification, you talk about two different types of classification. One of those would be systematic, and one of those would be taxonomic classification. Right? Now, if you're a systematic zoologist, you have three goals. Your first goal is simply to discover all animal species. All right? Now, your second goal would be to reconstruct their evolutionary relationships. So you would compare those animal species and see how they're related to each other. So that would focus on evolution. Third goal would be to communicate whatever you have discovered based on your observations and to construct some sort of informative taxonomic system. All right? So this is where taxonomy sort of sneaks its way into systematics. Now, if you notice for taxonomy, we have something called arrangement law. So you have a very formal system for naming and classifying a species based on a common feature. And sometimes the word that they will use for that particular common feature is something called an essence. All right? So again, there is a difference between the two. All right, we have some people, some individuals that are considered systematic zoologists, and we actually have some people that are considered taxonomic zoologists. All right, now the difference between the two is right here, and I'm hoping you recognize this. Here we have the mention of evolution. In other words, you're going to take into account the relationships that you see among the animals that you are comparing. If you're a taxonomist, you're not going to do that. All right? You're simply going to look at what's in front of you based on the common features that you notice, based on those essence characteristics that you notice. All right? So there is a difference between the two. Looking at our next slide, you're going to see we have a couple of people that are extremely important, again, to the historical aspect of classification. The first person's name is Aristotle, and the second person is Linnaeus. And Aristotle was a Greek philosopher or biologist, and he was actually one of the first people to classify organisms, and what he did is he based it entirely on what he saw. All right, so the observations that he made in regards to structure. Now, Linnaeus, on the other hand, he was a Swedish botanist, so he worked with plants. He actually took what he learned from Aristotle and invented what we have right now. So this is our current system of classification. Now, he still used morphology, so he still used form and structure. Right? He took what he saw in front of him. In addition, he also used what was ever necessary to produce that particular form. So he looked at the innards, he looked at the structure of those organisms. So he introduced what we call the hierarchical system of taxa, all right? And that's what you see right over here on the right-hand side. And I'm guessing some of you have seen this before. There are 7 major ranks when it comes down to this hierarchy: kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Sometimes we use mnemonic devices to memorize this. King Philip came over for good spaghetti. All right, so that's a way that you could remember them in order. So we're using the very first letter for each word to help us remember what order they need to go in. All right, but most of us have learned this in the past. Now, the names at each rank are called taxa. So when I use that word taxa, that's what we're referring to. All right, we're referring to whatever specific name has been given to that particular level. All right. So each rank can be subdivided. So in addition to the 7 that you see here, we could have, if you look right here, a category that would fit right here, and it would be considered a subfamily. Okay. Now you could actually have even a super family. All right. So that would be one that would fit right above it. Now some people would use the word superfamily. Some people would use the word sub order. All right, so it kind of depends on the person that you're talking to, and it kind of depends on what type of classification scheme they're working with. So there's lots of different varieties and takes on this scheme. So anyway, you can have subcategories when it comes down to these 7 different major ranks that you see on the right-hand side. Taxonomists no longer simply classify, they now systematically group based on evolutionary lineage. Now remember on the previous slide we had talked about the difference between systematics and taxonomists. If you're a systematic zoologist, you are putting into your idea of categorizing, you're thinking about evolutionary relationships. If you're a taxonomist, you tend to only look at what you see in front of you. You tend to look at form, you tend to look at structure, kind of like what Linnaeus did in the past. But overall, there's still some overlap between the two. So if you're a taxonomist, you still might be pulling in those evolutionary pieces into the way that you classify things. All right, so looking at this next slide, Linnaeus is again a major contributor when it comes down to certain aspects of classification that have pretty much become the norm in society. He was largely responsible for the technique or the way that we actually use to scientifically name organisms. He came up with what we call binomial nomenclature. So when you look at the scientific name of an animal, you're going to notice that it is typically a two-word name, all right? And that's what the prefix here means. It basically means two, all right? So the first word is going to be the genus, and it's typically capitalized like you see here. And the second is going to be the species name, all right? So it's going to be the species name. And typically it's going to be in all lowercase, so you do not capitalize the species name. Now, to properly write the name, if you are writing it by hand, you need to underline the species name. Now again, this is proper etiquette when it comes down to naming organisms. Now if you're typing it, then you don't have to underline it, but what you do need to do is you need to italicize the name, all right? And that's what you see on the right-hand side. Now if you notice it says the species name may be reused, but again the genus or the genera, now again this is just another word for genus, must always be different. Now that's exemplified by what you see over here on the right-hand side. So if you notice for this gazelle, we have this particular species name. If you notice for this white-throated rail, this bird, again, the same species name. And if you notice for this South American pupfish, again, the same species name. Species names tend to be descriptive, all right? Oftentimes it's descriptive in terms of what you might see with that particular animal. The genus name is different among all three. So again, it has to be a different genus name, but they can reuse the same species name, all right? So ranks above species are typically single names with a capital initial letter, all right? So let's say, for example, you're looking at the kingdom Animalia, all right? You always need to capitalize that letter, okay? So that's very important. Let's say you're looking at the phyla Platyhelminthes, all right? And I know that's a big word, but you would always capitalize Platyhelminthes, okay? So again, it's always capitalized. So any rank above species always has a capital initial letter. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and clear this off. All right, so this is going to be the final slide for our very first screencast for Chapter 10. And what we're going to do here is we're going to look at the criteria for recognizing a species. But first we have to define what a species is. And a species is a reproductive community that excludes members of another species and occupies a specific niche in nature. Okay, so I want to explain what this definition means using the diagram on the right. So what you're going to notice here is you're going to notice we have 4 different types of finches. All right, so each finch is going to feed on a different thing. This one's going to feed on seeds, this one's going to feed on fruits and flowers, this one's going to feed on the buds of plants, and this one's going to feed on insects. Okay, now if you notice, if you look at the beaks of each of these birds, they're a little bit different from each other. All right, so they're a little bit different. They have adapted for the feeding behavior in that particular niche in nature. Okay, so they each occupy a different niche. Now, I want you to think about exclusion, right? The ability for this bird to reproduce or produce offspring with this bird. Because they have changed so much, they can no longer successfully interbreed. And once they can no longer successfully interbreed, they are now considered distinct species. All right, that's one of the main criteria that we would use. So this is species number 1, species number 2, species number 3, species number 4. All right. Now, what makes it even more exciting is because we now have the ability to look at these birds at the molecular level. This has given us even more information to identify whether or not two individuals are actually different species. So we really don't even have to wait for them to attempt to reproduce. We can look maybe at their DNA, all right? And that's going to give us the information that we need to decide whether or not they are a different species. So again, maybe we cannot diagnose it simply by morphology, by form and structure. We can now look at stuff that in the past we did not have the ability to view or to observe. Okay, so that's what a species is. So again, a species basically means we have a member that is pretty much reproductively isolated. In other words, it can reproduce with members of its own group, members within its own niche, but if it moves outside of that niche and it attempts to interbreed with something else, if it can't, then they can't produce fertile offspring, then we're talking about two different species here. All right, so this will finish up our first screencast for Chapter 10. Just a reminder, please make sure that you fill in the form that is connected up to the screencast before you come to class.